some of the work that my graduate student, Corey, who's going to actually be the next speaker this morning, some work he and I have been doing on wetland reserve wetlands over in the Mississippi Delta. Of course, everybody knows that wetlands provide numerous functions for people and society. Among these are serving as wildlife habitat for people who enjoy looking at wildlife or going out and hunting ducks, for example. They provide aesthetic benefits to us. A lot of people like the way wetlands look. We like to look at wildlife or look at plants, other organisms that live there, or just enjoy the wetlands themselves. But perhaps one of the most important functions that they provide from a human health standpoint is a function of water purification. Wetlands are very important in removing things like nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus that run off from agricultural lands, as well as suspended materials that not only can carry nutrients with them, but sometimes also may carry other contaminants such as heavy metals and those sorts of things. And so wetlands provide a very important function by helping to purify water. The plants that grow in these wetlands and then the microorganisms that colonize the surface of these wetlands are important biological drivers of this purification process. And so this is one of the things that Corey and I are looking at, and what I'm going to be talking with you about this morning. So for example, wetlands in particular, these data come from some sort of a summary of studies of restored wetlands, where we see removal of things such as biological oxygen demand, which is organic materials that are transported through surface waters, removal of suspended solids, which could be just sediment materials that have run off from construction, from urban areas, from agriculture, nitrogen and phosphorus. And we see removals in unplanted wetlands. So these are restorations where the people responsible for the restoration didn't actually go out and plant wetland plants in these areas. Even without that planting, we see removal rates sometimes as high as 95%, but ranging anywhere from 4 to upwards of 90%. Again, depending on loading rates into these wetlands, the type of wetland configuration, etc. But when the wetlands are planted, we typically see those rates increase up to as much as 100% removal of biological oxygen demand, suspended solids, and even approaching that for things such as nitrogen and phosphorus being transported in surface waters. So wetlands can be very effective at removing these sort of, you might think of as standard surface water contaminants, especially things that would run off from agricultural lands. Wetlands also are important at removing things such as heavy metals, aluminum, cadmium, chromium, etc. And removal rates for these also depend on the type of wetland. So you see the lower end of these things are hardwood forested wetlands where you don't have the metabolic rates that you would find in a wetland that's inhabited by herbaceous plants, which may be colonized by lots of microbes and so forth, where generation times of both the plants and the microbes are pretty fast, and we see higher rates of removal because of that. They're just generally much more productive. But again, water purification is one of the most important functions of wetlands for human health and society. However, we also have seen historically huge losses in the acreage of wetlands in the United States, but elsewhere globally. For example, in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, we've lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 80% of wetlands based on estimates of historic wetland acreage in the region. In Mississippi specifically, it's estimated that we've lost about 60% of the wetlands that were present at the time of European colonization in the mid-1700s. Again, estimated by survey records and what we know about landforms and conversion to agriculture, etc. So about 60% loss of wetlands in Mississippi over a period of, I guess, about the last now 230, 240 years. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, every 5 years or so, will put out a publication called the Wetland Status and Trends Report. And up until recent years, until the last 15 years or so, we saw pretty steady losses in wetlands, and we saw heavy conversion of wetland to such things as urban development and agriculture. But what we've actually seen in the last 20 years or so is that lands that and typically these are marginal agricultural lands, are actually being converted back to wetlands. So we see wetland agriculture areas being planted into hardwoods, converted to what eventually would be forested hardwood wetlands. A lot of areas that are being converted through the Wetland Reserve Program into herbaceous wetlands for waterfowl habitat and these sorts of things. So although we've lost a lot of wetlands and we continue to lose wetlands, there have been gains in certain areas, and the areas, again, marginal agriculture are one of the areas where we see the greatest gains. And that's in particularly relevant in the case of our study, because we're working in a landscape that experiences heavy agriculture use. Large percentages of the landscape are in cultivated crops, and we'll see some maps in a minute that show the extent of that. But again, the last 20 years or so, since about the 1990s, we've seen conversion of some of these agricultural lands in the Mississippi Delta to wetlands, largely through the Wetland Reserve Program, but other conservation programs as well. Specific to Wetland Reserve and Conservation Reserve lands in the Mississippi Delta, we've seen about 190,000 acres of wetlands that have been put in place since about 1992. So there's a lot of land being converted, particular agricultural land being converted to wetlands, but one of the things that we don't really know is we don't know how effective this is. To what degree do those, what we think are restored wetlands, to what degree do they actually provide these services that we need, water purification, wildlife habitat, etc. And so that's one of the aims of the work that Corey and I, and now another student, Evelyn Wyndham, who's not here at the conference, but the three of us are working on this project in collaboration with Kevin Nelms of USDA, who's helped us put us in contact with some landowners who have provided access to their land, but also provided some technological expertise in designing some of these studies. So our aim here is to assess water quality and soil characteristics in the Mississippi Delta, or in Mississippi Delta wetlands, to determine to what degree wetland functional characteristics are influenced by surrounding land use. And the reason we're interested in particular in land use is this is a heavily agriculture-dominated landscape, and we'd like to know if future acreage is put into wetland restoration projects, is it possible that we could take data on land use patterns and actually site these wetlands in a location where they might provide the greatest benefit. So we can look at this region where the work is taking place, and we can look at a number of things. For example, we can take these data here from the USDA Agricultural Statistics Service, and we can look at the distribution of different crops. And these are actually summary data across, I think, 3 or 4 of the last 5 to 10 years in the Mississippi Delta, where we see the distribution of corn, cotton, and soybean acreage, and here it's represented as a percent of each of these individual watersheds in the Delta. And the darker numbers here in each of these are in the range of 25 to 30% of that watershed. For example, here, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25% of this particular watershed is in corn. Those up there, 25 to 30% of those, the total acreage is in just cotton production alone. And so in most of this part of the Delta here, what we see are high fractions of the land in these areas being used for agricultural production. And what this leads to is, in some cases, very high inputs of nitrogen fertilizer to the landscape. And this is a key piece of information that's of interest to us because, as we've seen in the last few years, the eutrophication of the northern Gulf of Mexico, the dead zone that's influenced by runoff of fertilizers, in particular nitrogen fertilizer running off from agriculture, not just here in Mississippi, but throughout the entire Mississippi River Basin from agricultural land use. And so there's a huge interest in reducing this runoff of nitrogen and preventing it from reaching the Gulf of Mexico. And so this was in part a focus of this study. We weren't necessarily measuring inputs of nitrogen, but we were using these data provided by the USDA to set up our study. And so what we did, we have 24 restored wetlands, we have 6 natural wetlands, and we stratified this across the northern portion of the Mississippi Delta, placing these wetlands, evenly distributing them across agricultural intensity in these individual watersheds. Again, we had 24 restored sites, and we had 3 categories. So we had 8 restored wetlands in watersheds that have high nitrogen inputs, 8 in medium, and 8 in low. And likewise with the reference wetlands, we had 2 that were in watersheds with high nitrogen inputs, 2 with medium, and 2 with low, so that we could capture the entire gradient of land use intensity in this portion of the delta. The data that were collected in the field for the particular work that I'm talking about here were water chemistry, such things as nitrate, dissolved oxygen, electrical conductivity, pH of the water, turbidity, redox potential. And then we also collected soil samples and took those to the state soil testing lab where they provided to us data on percent organic matter, phosphorus, pH, and cation concentrations, potassium, sodium, magnesium, calcium, etc. In the soil. So these were what we were in this particular part of the study using as wetland functional characteristics. And again, the idea here was to determine to what degree land cover data can inform us about the functional characteristics of these wetlands. So again, the land cover data we were using, first of all, was looking at the entire watersheds, the agricultural use intensity, nitrogen inputs in these areas, and we stratified, or we categorized these watersheds, again, based on low, which were watersheds that had up to 17.9 kilograms nitrogen per hectare, medium, and then high nitrogen input watersheds that had 39 and more than 39 kilograms nitrogen per hectare. Other land cover data that we used, getting at a much more local scale to the individual wetlands, was we pulled the National Land Cover Database data, which breaks the actual land cover, uses satellite imagery, breaks the land cover into about 12 to 15 categories, depending on where you are in this region. And we used these data, we took the wetlands and then created, using ArcGIS, buffers of 50 meters, 100 meters, and 200 meters around the margins of these wetlands, and extracted the land cover data within each one of these buffer distances. And so we use this as another potentially predictive metric of wetland function, water chemistry and wetland soil chemistry. So the hypothesis, the general hypothesis here, is that land use influences wetland soil and water chemistry, where we have these geospatially referenced land use data, and then the water chemistry and soil chemistry data that we collected ourselves, or at least we collected the samples in the case of soil and transported them to the testing lab. Again, with the hypothesis that land use is going to tell us something about wetland function. Okay, the first disappointment on my part was that there were very few significant correlations that we found in this data set. Wrong way. But what we did find, first of all, that there does appear to be some effect of nitrogen loading at that watershed scale. So whether you're in a watershed that has high nitrogen inputs, medium, or low, seems to some degree to influence water chemistry. This was the only variable that I found to be correlated with these categories of nitrogen inputs. So what we found was that our summer measurements of electrical conductivity of the water tended to be highest in wetlands that were situated in high nitrogen input watersheds. And this likely is because those fertilized inputs in those watersheds result in more dissolved materials reaching the wetlands themselves, so you have more dissolved materials in the surface water, higher electrical conductivity. We also saw this wasn't nearly as sharp a trend here, but we saw that the pH of the soil tended to be higher in those high ag intensity watersheds, although again it was statistically significantly higher, but there's not nearly the marked trend that we saw with the electrical conductivity in the water. And then we saw a significant difference among these three categories with soil organic matter, but there was no real pattern here. We saw that the soils from wetlands in the medium intensity watersheds, actually the organic matter content was lower than in the other two, and this was statistically different, but there's no pattern that we really could make any sense out of. However, what we did see with organic matter, when we went, instead of looking at the entire watershed, but we looked locally to those wetlands, we saw that there was a relationship between soil organic matter content and land use surrounding those wetlands. So we saw with land use just 50 meters around the wetlands, we saw a positive relationship between organic matter and the cover of wetlands surrounding the wetlands, so the fraction of that buffer that was occupied by wetland land cover, and then not a statistically significant relationship, but it looks like maybe there's a negative trend. But when we go out to 100 meters, what we actually see is that both of these are statistically significant, and this is a little bit stronger correlation with the wetland land use and soil organic matter. And again, when we go from 100 out to 200 meters, we see this relationship become just a little bit stronger. Again, a positive correlation. When there's greater fraction of wetland land cover surrounding these wetlands, we tend to see higher levels of organic matter within the soils of our individual study wetlands. And we also saw that there were some correlations between soil potassium content and land use, where both at the 50 meter and in the 100 meter buffers, we saw that soil potassium tended to be higher when there were higher levels of cultivated land use surrounding the wetlands. Again, this could well be runoff from fertilizers that are being used, potassium nitrate fertilizer, for example, where we may have this potassium running off into the wetlands from the surrounding agricultural lands. But these were the only relation, out of all of this, the water chemistry and soil chemistry data that we collected and the various types of land cover data, these were the only significant relationships that we saw. This is certainly not what we were expecting. So the results, not what we expected. So land use may influence wetland soil and wetland water chemistry, but not to the extent that we expected. Well, what's an explanation for this? Well, one possibility is that the scale at which land use affects wetland function and the resolution of the data that are being used, the important aspects of this may not be what we were looking at. In other words, looking at the entire watershed and agriculture across a whole watershed may not tell us much at all about what's happening within an individual wetland. And in fact, that's sort of what we saw here. Resolution of the data. So in the land cover data, where we did see this relationship when we looked at agricultural use and wetland properties, it's possible that if we segregated cultivated agriculture into different types of crops, we may actually see some relationships that we didn't pick up here. So with a finer resolution of the agricultural land, the land cover data, we may see some things that we didn't see in this analysis. It's possible that there's an important role of wetland structure. So what is living in the wetland, so the plant composition, the plant species composition within the wetland could have a more important role than land cover across an entire watershed. And this is actually something that we're looking at, and Corey's going to talk with you a little bit about this in his presentation. And then, of course, it's possible that there are important interactions between these things that we're not picking up in this initial analysis of these data. Again, one very important aspect of this could be that we have different plant assemblages in different wetlands based on past land use history, the management of that particular wetland itself, and then proximity to other wetlands that have particular suites of plant species. And this could be an important driver of things that definitely wasn't something that I looked at in this set of analyses here. And again, Corey's going to talk with you guys a little bit about that in the next presentation. But before I close, I need to acknowledge assistance that was provided by Kevin Nelms of the USDA, who introduced us to landowners and helped us identify wetlands that might be appropriate for this study. Some of the WRP landowners, the Tallahatchie National Wildlife Refuge that allowed us to use one of their wetlands. Evelyn Wyndham, who's been working a lot with Corey, helping him carry out some of the work, and both of them are carrying on this project in its second year this year. And then the MSU Water Quality Lab that was extremely helpful in providing the water quality analyses for this work.